everybody. Welcome to the 2020 Art Behind the Game Con. And my name is Paula Webb. I'm the USA Outreach and Communications Librarian. Thank you so much for joining us today. And our last and final speaker, but an amazing speaker, is Brian D. Anderson. He's going to talk on world building. It's more than just fantasy. Thank you so much, Brian, for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, it's a real pleasure. I love the. Oh my goodness. Anyway, I'm very excited to be here and to be talking about world building, and I know for aspiring writers and gamers, it's very crucial. But before I get into that, let me tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Brian D. Anderson, and I know some of you might have thought it was Brandon Sanderson, but no, I didn't realize how much my name looked like his until about 6 months after the release of my first book. So I grew up right here on the Eastern Shore, grew up in Spanish Fort. I live in Fairhope, Alabama now. I have been a professional author of primarily epic fantasy for the past 10 years. I started out as an indie, and I was an indie for 9 years and had a really good independent career as an independent author. My first series, The Godling Chronicles, sold amazingly well and enabled me to take things further. My second series, Dragon Vein, was equally successful. The audiobook even got stuck up there on as a top 5 finalist for Fantasy Book of the Year. Jim Butcher won, but hey, I was just glad that I see my name up next to his and Terry Pratchett's and some of the greats. And then I co-authored a series called Akiri with a very talented writer named Stephen Saville. He wrote for Pathfinder, Warhammer, and the Doctor Who franchise, and I think he even wrote a Sherlock Holmes book. He was a joy to work with. Then after that, I tackled The Veil, which is, I've been playing a lot of games like Final Fantasy and Tales of, and I wanted to do a novelized version of the tropes and the plot devices that you frequently see in those games. I really love the plots, so I created a new world and original characters, but I used those sort of devices for the story, and it was a lot of fun, and nearly got picked up by Tor Books, except that I had already sold the audio rights, and without the audio rights these days, you cannot, the traditional publishers won't mess with you. But it did lead me to sending Tor, because they asked to see my next series. Or my next thing was The Bard's Blade, which is book 1 right here of The Sorcerer's Song. And book 2, A Chorus of Fire, just came out August 11th. And this is my first foray into traditional publishing. Let me set this right over here. And it's been a joy working with Lindsay Hall, editor, one of the senior editors over there, and all the art directors and the promotional staff. They're just a fantastic group of people. Anyway, that sort of leads me today, until today. I'm working on the final book of the series, and I have 3 more indie books that I'm nearly finished with some of them. And that brings us to why I'm qualified to talk about world building. Anyway, let's get to it. Now, world building is important not just for fantasy and science fiction, though those are the genres that it's primarily people think of that when they think about world building. Even if you're writing in a contemporary setting, say if you're writing about Fairhope, Alabama, I'll just use the town I live in as an example. Knowing how a fantasy author builds a world will help contemporary works express the details about the real world that help the reader get more immersed into the story and brings it to life. Whereas so understanding how fantasy authors, what they decide to put forward and how they decide to do it, can inform real life settings. So understanding how to do it can be beneficial, even if you're not writing fantasy. Let's see here. Oh, wow. I am. Oh, wow. Whoa, 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 whoa. Oh, my goodness. Okay. I am taking a moment to share this with some of my friends. So if you will just bear with me. Okay, there we go. Posting. Yes, there we go. That is shared. Now we are back to it. Now in fantasy, which is what I'm going to focus on, and by the way, I'm representing my son's team here, the Fairhope Pirates. He's a senior this year and largely responsible for helping me with my career. But that's another story. Magic, as it pertains to world building and fantasy, is probably the most important aspect in my way of thinking. Magic and fantasy, they go hand in hand. So, but first, before you include it into your fantasy world, you need to decide whether or not you're going to have a hard magic system or a soft magic system. Now, if you don't understand the difference, I'm here to help you. Hard magic systems are magic systems with definite rules. Think of it as laws of physics that can't be violated. But you set these rules, so you can set these up and however you choose. But once they're set up, if you're using a hard magic system, you need to pretty much adhere to it. Otherwise, you're going to lose the reader, and they're going to criticize you heavily for that. A good example of hard magic systems, The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. You have Mistborn and the Mistborn series by Brandon Sanderson, and they the way they present their magic systems, you understand what magic can do, what magic can't do. So that's a hard magic system. Now, a soft magic system, magic works because it's magic. There are no really hard, fast rules to it. The danger with using that kind of magic system is you can, I'm going to use a reference that only people my age are going to get. Cloak and Dagger. There was a movie back in the 80s where Jack Flack escapes because he rolled a 10. So with soft magic systems, you might be tempted to, if you write yourself into a corner, save yourself with an unknown power because you have a soft magic system, you can get away with it. But the reader will notice, and I don't suggest doing that. The best example I can think of soft magic systems is Harry Potter. Harry Potter, like when Dumbledore repairs the apartment with the wand, and everything scatters up, and the apartment's all immediately back to where it was before they went to go recruit Slughorn, I think his name was. Anyway. That's an example of soft magic system. But Rowling does it exceedingly well, but it's hard to deny that she does use that to write herself out of a corner in a few instances. Though she does stay consistent with her what rules she does establish, and I love Rowling. I think she's done more for children's literacy than any 10 authors that's ever lived. I mean, you had children who wouldn't read a pamphlet reading 700-page monsters. That's incredible to me. But anyway, now once you establish what sort of magic system you're going to have, you need to take into account how it's going to affect the world you are building. What effect does it have on the environment, for example? By that, if you have an area where a bunch of rocks are floating around, obviously, if the laws of physics are the same and there's gravity, magic has to have affected that. Does it what kind of effect does it have on the plant life, on the animal life, if any? You don't have to have it have an effect on it, but you need to decide whether or not it does. And like certain streams, like say you don't drink out of a certain stream because it's maybe polluted with magic and it'll turn you in orange and spotted. Who knows? You also need to decide whether or not your magic system is going to have an effect on society, and which almost it certainly will, writing fantasy, and what effect that is. Do people who wield magic, are they ostracized? Are they revered, feared, loved, hated? How does it affect? Are they hunted down? So you need to, in your world building, how does the existence of magic affect societies and different groups of people and the way they interact? So once you've had that established, which by the way can take a little while, you need to start constructing your world. Now, before I get into how to what the way I construct a world, I would like to point out that world building is icing on a big cake. You can get lost in world building. You can get to a point where you sacrificing character and plot in favor of world building. You can't get so wrapped up in the world that you forget to tell the story. Now, the examples I use of what's more important, the characters and plot or the building of the world, I said, well, if you ask people what is Star Wars about or what is the Lord of the Rings about, they're not going to tell you the Death Star or Tatooine or Mordor, Mount Doom, or Rohan. They're going to say it's about Luke and Leia and Han and Chewie and Frodo and Gandalf and Aragorn and their whatever quests they are on. So it's not about the world; it's about the story and the characters. Now I've seen some writers, especially in the early days of fantasy in the 70s and 80s, that concentrated so heavily on the world that they had to use so much exposition and information dump. They almost needed a separate book to explain the world before the reader could even understand what was going on. You don't see as much of that these days, but you also have writers that are weak-willed world builders, but very good at characterization and plot. Optimally, what you want to be is good at both. And that's where I think like Rothfuss is tremendously good at that. Nicholas Eames is excellent at that. Kings of the Wild, if you hadn't read Kings of the Wild, you should. He's also, I got to confess, he is also a friend of mine, but that doesn't detract from the fact that he's brilliant. And if this is some of you gamers out here are, have listened to the first two lectures, you should check out Nick's book. It's almost a love letter to Dungeons and Dragons, and there's actually a bugbear in it. It's amazing. But anyway, you got to start building your world. Building your world, the way I do it, I divide it into two sections, the physical and the societal. And the societal has a bunch of subsections in it, but we'll dive into that in a minute. The physical world is basically what your world would look like if you were walking into it, having never seen it. What would you see? No people, just what do you see there? And like some examples is cosmology. Does it have two moons? Does it have two suns? What are the stars like? Does it have certain bright stars that catch your attention? What is the geography, the geology, volcanic activity, things like that? What is the overall climate, especially if you're writing a large epic with multiple kingdoms and nations and many continent. Even some has multiple continents, like Game of Thrones. Um, what environment? How will the environment change as your characters move through this world? Um, if you think about what the climate is like here in the deep south compared to what if I were to travel on foot for 2 months due north, I would be noticing a marked change in the temperature and the landscape and the flora, the fauna. So everything that isn't a character is what you have to decide. Even things like how long is a year? How does time pass? How do the seasons pass? Now you can get pretty fantastical with this because you're not really bound by any strict set of rules. But once you've made the decision and through your story of, say, if winter comes twice a year or something like that, then you need to make sure you stick to that. You need to be aware of how the passage of time within the story, within your world, what happens through the seasons that affect the physical realities that you've decided to create your story. Then there's the societal end of it. And that has to do with cultures and have fantasy races. Are you going to have elves, dwarves, trolls? Are you going to make up your own fantasy race? What kind of tools do people? What level of technology are you deciding to create within? Are you using medieval technology or pre-industrial, or if you're doing contemporary fantasy, you're using modern technology? I mean, so you need to decide, where the societies are technologically. What kind of clothing, fashion, and if you're doing a large epic, how does this fashion change from area to area? If you, I remember when I moved to New York back in October of 2000, the clothes people wore were very different from what I was used to around here. And if you go to Japan or China or South America or Africa, you're going to notice a difference in in fashion. So be aware of that. Manners of speech, accents. If you're not, are you going to use different languages, and how are you going to express that to the reader? Are you actually one of those types who can make up, you know enough about that kind of thing where you can actually make up a language? Or are you going to simply say that they speak a different language and explain to the reader this is the language that they're speaking at the time? Sanderson does that in the Story Life Archives a bunch of times. And I kind of like that because I'm personally not very good at coming up with new languages. But the accents, if they are all speaking the same language, is there a common language? Are you going to differentiate the societies by even class structures by people's mode of speech? Now, what kind of governments are you going to have? You got to be all these things. Are you going to use a monarchy, or are you going to use an autonomous collective? A little bit of Monty Python reference there. So, and are they going to be universal throughout your world? Or see, because each time if you're writing a large epic and you're really building a world, having the understanding that things change both in the physical and societal as your characters, say, travel from one nation and go 3 nations over, this is where you start getting really deep into the world building, and what takes a very long time to flesh out. Now, this may be very frightening for you discovery writers out there, or more commonly called pantsers. There's the pantsers and there's the plotters. For a plotter, this kind of stuff it becomes a little easier because you can, in fact, know all this information, and you're not only plotting out your story, but you can map out your world pretty accurately. Excuse me. But for a discovery writer, this can be a little more challenging because, but challenging in the sense of continuity. So what you want to do is, I'm naturally a pantser. I'm a discovery writer by nature, but lately I've had to sort of make a switch over to being an outliner. And what you want to do is, as new things come up in your world, you want to write them down, put them somewhere in a folder, a file, a little notebook, however you organize your thoughts. But you do want to, because in a lot of times, especially in long epics that are that extend out to multiple editions, you can lose track of where you are, what you did, and readers will notice. So I could literally go on and on and on about the different physical and societal aspects of a world build. And there's just so much you can cover and so much you can know. Now, which is going to lead us into our next part of this. How much does the reader need to know of this fantastic world that you've built? Well, not as much as you might think. Out of all the things in the physical world and the societal world that you can include in your world building, there's really going to only be a handful of them that you'll be able to focus on and be able to incorporate into your story and still maintain your pacing. For those of you who are writers or taking creative writing courses or anything like that, you understand what I mean by pacing. For those of you who don't, you will soon enough as you continue on trying to become a better writer. The method that I tend to use is pretty common. It's the iceberg method. Almost all the writers I know, the fantasy writers anyway, I know use this. It's about the most common method that there is. And basically it's just like, here's the tip of the iceberg, and this is what the reader knows. Everything beneath that, the reader has no clue about. Only person that knows is the author. And the point of this is to avoid information dumps and a bunch of exposition and basically grinding your story to a screeching halt. One moment. All right. Grinding it to a screeching halt and losing the reader. Now, a couple things happen. One, especially with writers who really get into world building, that's their thing, and they spend sometimes years. I mean, Tolkien never stopped creating new lore and new aspects to Middle Earth. Unless I'm mistaken, up until Robert Jordan was diagnosed with a terminal illness, he was still building his world. So it can be a never-ending process if that's the kind of person you are. Problem is, after you've done all this hard work, you want to share it, and you want to show the reader all this wonderful world that you've created. But you can't. You know, I mean, there's just things that the reader just doesn't need to know in order to move the story forward. There's an old saying in theater: if there's a gun on the table at the beginning of Act 1, by the end, somebody needs to be shot. So you need to decide what guns to put on the table. And that's not to say that you can't add color and depth to the world by explaining details that aren't necessarily important. Matter of fact, if you focus too much time on something, it better have some relevance to the story. And I thought of an example of this with Sanderson. He's one of my favorite writers, but he's not perfect any more than any other writer is. And at the beginning of the Stormlight Archives, we are introduced to Adolin. And he focuses, and we see stuff like rock buds, and it doesn't tell, and Spren and all these things that he's using to give the world depth. But he also starts focusing a lot on these brands that Adolin, is it Adolin? No, it's not Adolin. Oh my goodness, Adolin's somebody else. But anyway, one of the main characters, and his name escapes me for some reason. But these slave brands that he has on his forehead, and he mentions them like a bunch in the beginning. So I'm thinking that these things are going to play an important part, or there's going to be something about it. They just sort of vanish, and they're not mentioned until much later. To me, in my in spite of how much I love the Stormlight Archives, and I suggest if you're a fantasy fan, you have to read it. It's a brilliant piece of work. But there's an aspect of that I noticed that, why did he include so much of that and then just sort of let it vanish? Which kind of brings you to the point of so you gotta, you can't explain everything about your world. You have to put your reader on a learning curve. Now, the idea of the iceberg method is eventually to lower the waterline basically more and more and more until the reader becomes an expert in the world. Now, that's not to say that they need to know everything, but they need to be able to, any questions you've posed, any mysteries that you've presented need to at some point be resolved in their minds that they understand it. So one of the old school methods is the Maiden Butler technique, which I hate a lot. And they used that back in the old vaudeville era. They would have a maid and a butler basically give a bunch of exposition and information, basically an information dump to explain the scene that was about to happen. Now, what you want to do is drip and drab this information about your world in order to pose questions that you would later on answer. Now, the scary part especially for aspiring authors, people who are new to this, is you're afraid if you present something that has no good explanation or part of the world that you don't necessarily need to be using any kind of exposition or information. Now, if you don't do that, then you're going to lose the reader's interest, and that's just simply not true. And I'll go back to the same scene that I was talking about in the Stormlight Archives. As much as the brands on his forehead, I didn't see the point to them because they sort of faded away. He does these amazing things. He introduces rock buds and Spren and different people from different nations, and without necessarily telling you what a rock bud is or what a Spren is. And you don't lose interest. You do eventually find out what they are, at least still kind of unsure about Spren, but you can, but the questions get answered later. So fearing losing the reader's interest because you don't explain something is a baseless fear. The example I give on a way that there's no 100% right way to do anything, but here's an example I give on a way to do this. I created a scene that I use in talks, world building talks. Is Man wakes up in the morning. He looks over to his nightstand. He sees a broken locket and looks at it. He's not happy. He's clearly upset about that the locket is broken. So he gets up, gets dressed, has some breakfast, shoves the lock in his pocket, and checks to see how much money he has on him. And as he's moving up past the window, covers his nose because this horrible odor is drifting in through the window. This sickly sweet, he just can't stand it. It makes him want to retch. And as soon as he opens the door, there's this chirping, high-pitched chirp coming from somewhere on a neighbor's roof, and he winces at the sound. He leaves his house, winds his way through the streets, goes down an alley, is confronted by three thugs who he knows who they are. He knows they're bad guys, and but they rob him, and he fights back, and they beat the tar out of him and beat him until he's unconscious. They take his pendant, they take his money, they take everything, and he wakes up at home, surrounded by his family, and the constable is there. He tells the constable that he was on his way home from having his pendant repaired, from dropping his pendant off to be repaired, and that he didn't recognize the hooligans who attacked him. Well, we know that's not true. We know they took the pendant. We know he didn't drop it off anywhere. We also know he knows who the people who robbed him were. So what I've done here is I've created a bunch of mystery that I can later on sort of present answers to these questions. Even the small things like the sickly sweet odor I mentioned. Perhaps that's a mold that grows in areas that are the more poor parts of town, right? And every time you smell it, you're not in the rich side. So if you know that, you sort of know the relative wealth of the character without me having to tell you. Once I've sort of made it clear where that smell came from, I can, if I bring it back up, you automatically get this air of poverty and the downtrodden right away. The high-pitched chirping, perhaps that's an insect that only comes out at certain times a year. So I have given depth to the world by explaining basically a season. Now the pendant. What if later on we find out that what the pendant, say it's a cultural object that the head of each family possesses, and it's passed down, and whoever possesses it becomes the head of that family. And without it, they can't buy, sell, trade. Basically, they'll be ostracized from society without it. And he didn't want anybody to know it had been stolen. He intends to go find it himself and recover it before anybody finds out. So, as you can see there, the answer, I'm telling you the answers to this with exposition, but what you would want to do is sort of give all this world building and plot building. World building and plot building go hand in hand, and you want to drip and drab that out throughout the course of the story. And what you got to decide is what kind of learning curve you want to put your reader on. Do you want a steep learning curve where basically you drop somebody down into the world and you don't really give them much of anything? They have to sort of learn it as along the way. Or do you want more of a shallow learning curve like we see in Harry Potter, where basically you're learning as Harry learns. You usually have a character who knows a bunch of stuff, who is basically there to explain the world to Harry, and in turn explain it to the reader. So once you've decided on that, it should, if you have your world built and you understand the learning curve that you're going to put your reader on, you're well on your way to creating a pretty world with a lot of depth and a world that you can satisfactorily set your story in. Now, I would as much as I would love to get into the details of how to incorporate plots into world building. I have been speaking for quite some time now. I was wondering, does anybody have any questions for me? I would love to hear them.
Hello. What a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. I'm looking for questions. If anybody would like to chat, certainly type it into the chat and we can ask Brian. What a great opportunity to ask a published author information or tips or suggestions on world building. I've certainly learned a good bit since I've been listening. I've been making notes while you've been talking. Things that are useful for things that I'm working on. So I'm sure that
it does work with real world settings. If I was describing Pharaoh, I would have to pick out what in that area would I need to express to the reader in order for them to feel like they've actually been in town. So I can't give them every detail, but if I did, it would just grind everything to a halt. And pacing is really important, especially in fiction. Pacing is extremely important, and once you set a pace, you need to stay along with that pace, because if you don't, the reader notices and you jar them out of the story. And that's when you have a lot of did not finish, because of that. So when setting up a story, should the first focus be on world building and character building? World built around a character. Well, there's no right answer to that. I personally developed the plot and the characters first, and the reason, and here's how I want you to think about that question. If you can take your characters and your plot and take them out of whatever world they're in, and put them in another genre, and it still be a good story, you have something. The world, on the other hand, is just an empty place until you put characters in it. Now, if you are somebody who enjoys world building, there's no reason you shouldn't do that first, if that's what you want to do. But you just got to keep in mind, it's just an empty world until you have your characters and your story. So I don't know if that helps. Let's see. Any other questions? Input. Oh, yes, Helen. Oh, this is Helen. Yes. Has he given any further suggestions since then? My son actually came up with the original concept for the Godling Chronicles, and so he gives me input all the time. It's mostly, Dad, can I have the keys? Now, my son actually is a fine little writer, and he's only 17. He's better than I was at his age. So I'm inspired more by his abilities and what I see for him in the future. Certainly, if that counts as input. So, also, Tales of fan, which is your favorite? Vesperia? I like all the Tales of though. Yeah, Tales of are great. But my favorite RPG and what actually inspired me the most to write The Veil, and The Veil is, by the way, available on Amazon, and it's on audio. The narrator, Derek Perkins, is phenomenal. But was Final Fantasy X, and that was that's going on almost a 20-year-old game, but the plot behind it is amazing. And the world they built, even the world building, everything about that game was amazing. I know a lot of people are fans of Final Fantasy VII, and I am too. But there was something about Final Fantasy X that just was inspiring to me as a storyteller. Oh, who else? Who's got? And it doesn't have to be about world building. I'm happy to answer any questions about any aspects of what I do. At least I'll do my best to answer it.
Mhm.
No? Bueller?
Sometimes it's that way.
Huh?
Oh, goodness. That might be it. You talked a
Okay,
good
well,
while,
that's fine. We're down to the last, I think,
like 10 minutes, so we're good.
we got 10 minutes. Oh, great. There's a lot of things I can talk about in 10 minutes.
Okay, go for it. It's up to you.
Oh, no. Yeah. I'm gonna give everybody their money's worth. Oh, wait. This is free, right? They probably
Great.
got their money's worth.
Thank you so much.
Oh, no
Um,
problem. Now, just to let you know, one of the things I didn't bring up as a writer is, and as far as world building, is the fact that you need to is maps, and those are important because
oh,
I meant to bring up maps, but you need a personal map, and you need to keep it with you at all times, and you need to know where everything is, because one of the biggest mistakes in continuity is just general direction. Now, and how far away one thing is from another thing. And you need to know, like, how far can you travel on a horse during a day? How long can your average person travel on foot if they're during the course of a day? So that means you need to have your map. Say if you're going to from town A to town B,
mhm.
you need to have it at least sort of scaled to where you know if that's 100 miles, how long is it going to take your characters to make that journey? And without a map and without that sort of detailed guide, you're going to run into a bunch of continuity errors. I did it once, and there's a mistake in the Godling Chronicles. There's actually two. There's actually two continuity errors that I found, and it took me years to find them. But nobody's ever. I'm not going to say what they are because nobody's ever called me on them.
Okay.
I found them. One is where one character is going the entirely wrong direction compared to where I set up the set the scene, and when they leave there, I actually say the direction they're going in, and that would put them on the other side of where they were headed, and nobody's noticed it. And I do have to repeat one action that nobody's ever caught yet. I mean, but things like this, as a writer, that's why it's important to take these notes in your world building. Character notes are important, but like I said, they mean that we're focusing on world building. Taking these detailed notes are super important because once you put the work in and once you have your book written, one of the worst feelings in the world would be to have it published if you went the self-publishing route and put it out there and people start reading it, and you have continuity errors all over the place, and they're catching it because you won't catch it. A lot of times you won't catch it. There's a old saying, "Too close to see clearly." That's why we have editors. That's why we have people to look at these continuity errors. That's why when when I handed off the Bard's Blade to my editor, she went through it, looked for continuity errors, right? And she found a couple, but mostly that's what she was primarily looking for. More like prose repetition, things like that, and it's more substantive story and substantive editing, developmental editing. But when it went to Dorothy Zamak, who was also one of my indie editors, but she also worked for Macmillan Educational, so they let me bring her over to do the copy editing for the Bard's Blade and for the entire series. And she would find all these continuity errors, and this is me using a map and notes, and I'm still making some mistakes, So imagine if you're not taking these kind of notes when you're building your world, and then finding out it slipping through the cracks. It's one of the most humiliating things you can imagine. That is just it's a gut punch. Because you put so much work into it, and especially you're so proud of your work, and you're proud of this world you built. You think everything's stellar, and then somebody just gut punches you with, "Hey, did you know that the mountain that you described over here, and when in 5 chapters down, where's the mountain was gone?" Or something like that, or you said the moon was full. Or say I have 2 moons and they were in a certain spot, and your character, it's the 2 weeks later and the moons are exactly the same. And when you've already shown examples of the moons moving around, and like our moon, So these kind of continuity errors, which make they're terrible for a writer's self-esteem. And I don't know how important stuff like this it is to the reader. I've never really been all that bothered by it, as long as it's not repeated a bunch of times. But it's also why taking all these detailed notes and hanging on to them, because I've lost some of my notes from the Godling Chronicles, and I had to, and I did a sequel to it, and I had to basically reread the entire series, because it had been years since I dove into that world, and I had to reread and retake notes, and I had to redraw a map and make it as close to what I had what I could remember before. So not only is it important to take these notes, but it's also important to keep them in a safe place, somewhere where you can access them, somewhere because if say you're writing a book and something happens and you have to stop halfway through it, you don't want to have to, start from scratch basically and critically reread. You may want to do it because say there's certain books I write in a certain style, and certain books I write in a different style. Sometimes if I'm going back into a world, I'll read it. That was one of the reasons I did want to reread the first book in the Godling Chronicles, because it was my first novel. And I was to say I was amateur would be kind.
I mean, you did.
I mean, 17 novels later, you get better at it,
Yeah, definitely.
So are there any other questions? Anything? Anybody?
Well, maybe they went out for Saturday and they'll watch it later. They're like, "Oh yeah."
Oh, that's fine. There's 4 people watching right now. Looks like.
So. Well, I'm ready for anything in this environment right now. After everything
I want to really thank you for having me on, and I've really enjoyed this. I love giving these kind of things. It's the first time I've done this kind of thing. What's my world building theme? That's an actual. That was something I debated on whether to touch, because you have so many great writers writing outside the Eurocentric theme, and I don't have really a favorite. I love East Asian themes. I don't necessarily write in them because I'm not expert enough to do so adequately without just getting a bunch of things wrong. And but I love that type of stuff. I usually like with a new series that I'm going to be that's going to follow up after the Sorcerer's Song. I'm creating entirely new themes, and there's going to be two continents. One is going to be almost just pre-industrial, and the other one is going to be medieval.
Mm.
And magic in both has a completely different function in for both societies. But yeah,
Mm.
I love what Evan Winter did with with setting it in a setting in Africa. Um,
Mhm.
and you have just so many different really cool themes that are coming out as far as people's world building. That's one thing I
Mhm.
love about my genre. I will say I actually was able to stretch it to nearly the time. One of the
Yeah.
wonderful things about fantasy as a genre is that we don't seem to suffer from the same plague that you're seeing in movies and comics, and which I think maybe is partially because they're a younger art form, and people
Mhm.
don't. Whereas literature, people have a harder time. You don't. Yeah, let's face it. Lord of the Rings is a great story, but it's not the most diverse story in the world. Yeah. It, but we don't change that. We don't go back and change that. What we do is we add on, and
Mhm.
we add modern sensibilities into what we do, rather than go pull a George Lucas and make I'm sorry, Han shot first. You know,
Yeah.
and so it's all. But what it's also done is open up a lot of great new world building themes that you just didn't see before. Um, I tend to try to write what I know,
Mhm.
and but we with fantasy we have what I do. Like I'm considered more of a classic fantasy author, but we also
Mhm.
have, instead of me being supplanted by you know a, a new type of fantasy, is in let's see, it turned a young person from a helpful, kind young lady. That's my special book. Oh my gosh, Helen is awesome. We don't have time for me to tell the story of Helen and her daughter, but it's an amazing story. But no, what I'm saying is that I love that my genre
Mhm.
continues to build and grow without losing its roots, and without you don't have to do away with Tolkien to have Evan Winter.
Right.
And I think that's wonderful. And the new diverse stories are being told from a bunch of different perspectives, and I think that's great. And
Mhm.
it makes me very, very pleased that I am a part of that community, and that I have come into what I do at this point in time, even
Mhm.
though uh, at this point in time it may seem a little scary.
Yeah. Most definitely.
But I think that's about but what we got. So hopefully that helps some of you out there, and that if you can find me online, Brian D. Anderson. I'm all over the web. If
Mhm.
you I'm always happy to answer questions. Author Brian D. Anderson at Blogspot. You can find me on Facebook, and I happy to answer questions. Happy to, if there's some aspiring writers out there who maybe see this and have a question they didn't get a chance to answer. Feel free to contact me. I'm always. It may take me a little while to get back to you, but I always will get back to you.
Well, thank you so much, Brian. This was wonderful. Right. And you have
Thank
a
you. I
wonderful,
appreciate you having me here. I really do.
no problem. Have a great day.
You too.